Why don't we go ahead and get started? If everyone wants to come sit down, we can get started here. Good evening. I'm Ken Roselle, an Assistant City Attorney. We're here tonight for a community workshop on the proposed districting process. We wanted to have a community workshop because we wanted this to be a little more informal so we could have more of a dialogue. The turnout is not as big as we had hoped, but we'd still request that you fill out a speaker card so we can call people up, and once we do one round of speaker cards, then we can go back around for as long as 3 hours. So we're happy to have that dialogue with you as you go forward. Now, most of you here I've seen at a number of our meetings, but just a very quick overview of how we got here. Our process started on November 27th when the City Council adopted a resolution of intent to transition from at-large to district-based elections. January 5th was our deadline for the submittal of maps. As of the deadline, 65 maps were submitted and not withdrawn. And in addition, our demographer created 2 more maps. So of all these maps that were submitted, 39 maps met the basic qualifications for number of districts, contiguous districts, and population balanced. And just last week on Wednesday, the City Council held a public hearing to discuss the maps, and the city's demographer, Doug Johnson, gave an overview. And today, we have another demographer from National Demographics, Robert McIntyre, who's going to go over the PowerPoint from last Wednesday, and then we'll have a chance to drill into any of the questions you have on any of the maps and any of our recommendations. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn over to Robert for his presentation.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? I feel like I'm in stereo. So tonight, the real purpose is to once again review the maps. For those of you who couldn't make it to the last City Council meeting, it's a real opportunity to ask as many questions as you feel that would be beneficial. It is definitely imperative that the City Council hear from you on what you consider important characteristics around drawing these maps, because we're kind of in this situation where we have so many choices, it becomes a lot of noise, and it's very difficult for the City Council to really kind of whittle this down, or it can be. And so your input is going to become more and more crucial as the Council looks to take its next steps. And so I'll briefly, but slowly, work through the slides that are here, and then we can just dive right into your questions and hopefully get everybody to a place where they feel like they can help the Council move the process forward. So, as we've heard a few times, looking at districting criteria, we first have to start with the Federal Voter Rights Act, and we have to make sure that the districts, when they're drawn, are relatively equally balanced, and relatively, I mean very, very closely balanced, and that we can't use race as the sole criteria for drawing a council district. When we look at the more traditional districting criteria, really looking at communities of interest is where we want to focus the conversation. I think where it'll help the council the most as they start looking at the options before them, and even for our conversation later tonight. When we do look at those communities of interest, we want to say, are they compact? Do they follow important landmarks or barriers or streets that make sense within our community as far as how we want to divide up the city into the council districts? And then one of the other criteria that we try to do is observe the wishes of the voters in the last election. So we don't intentionally try to put all the council members together needlessly. And some of the maps have done that and some haven't. I think there's a good cross-section of options there. So the city has done a nice job of soliciting community input. In fact, this has been one of the best turnouts I've seen in quite a long time. There was a forum in South Oxnard a couple weeks ago. Many community members employed the online districting tool, and we even had some people use the Excel paper sheets for drawing their maps. And you know, when it's your first time delving into this particular area, it can seem a little overwhelming at first, but it's clearly a few of the community members really embraced it. We had some local city officials embrace the mapping process and really put together some really interesting options for the city council to consider. Additionally, I know that there was advertising both in English and Spanish about the forums, including this particular forum, and there's translation in the back if anybody needs it. So our company, National Demographics, received over 80 different pieces of communication, whether it be maps, questions, ideas. Some were just, I'm really interested in one area, some's, here's an entire map. And so in the end, about 72 maps were submitted, with 59 being using the online tool. 34 of those maps were submitted by one person, but I understand there was some give and take on which one should have been the final versus keeping them all available. So that's not meant to be put out there as a point of antagonism, more just great input. So as I said, many of the maps were drawn by quite a few different submitters. 7 divided the city only into 2 or 3 council district areas, which doesn't meet the California Voter Rights Act. For a city like Oxnard, you're looking at 4, 6, or 8 council districts, and I think for tonight's presentation, we've narrowed it down to those. One map did not contain contiguous districts. That's where you have a trustee council area being bisected by another council area, splitting it into 2 pieces. That doesn't meet the California Voter Rights Act, so that map was set aside. So of the legal maps submitted, we have 13 4-district maps, 26 district maps, and 4 8-district maps. And to kind of round out the options for the community and the council, National Demographics drew 1 additional 4-district map and 1 additional 8-district map. So what we've tried to do is group these maps based on their what we consider design consistency. So you'll see, for example, in the 4-district maps, where maybe some of the drawings were really trying to focus on the north or focus on the south, and so we try to group those together. So when you're trying to look at so many of them at one time, it tends to draw your eyes to certain features that are important to you. And as the council hears about those, and I'm going to take notes of everything you say, and I know it's being recorded as well, so that way that can be shared back out and we can make recommendations moving forward. So looking at the 4-district maps, as I said, there were 14 legal maps. There were 3 that unite the South in 1 district and have 2 districts in the north. There were 2 that unite the north in 1 district and have 2 in the south. And then 4 maps that unite both the north in 1 district and the south in 1 district. And you see it kind of looks like a nice 4-quadrant map. So looking at the 2 districts in the north maps, you can see map 412, 414, and 417. And what they do is they really divide up the communities in the north just slightly differently. So when we look at 412, we see that the northernmost portion of town is included along with the east side in District 3, and District 2 is just very, very compact. And then we see almost the opposite scenario in 414, where District 2 goes all the way up to the north, and so you end up with this very strong westerly section of town, and Section 3 becomes very, very compact, Trustee Area 3, District 3. And then when we look at 417, we see that the divider, it actually divides up more on the westerly side of town, so you end up with a larger easterly section. And so if the north was an important characteristic of maps for you as a part of the community, then you can see you've kind of got one split in the middle, one heavily west, one heavily east. And so that provides some real options. When we look at options for 4 district maps with 2 areas in the south and 1 in the north, it's really kind of what is the dividing line and how far down does the 2nd district come. So when we look at 403, we see that, in the color, I apologize, green and blue don't show up so well on the computer screen, but they do show up pretty decent up there actually. So we see that they're divided all the way down to the southernmost tip of town, districts 3 and 4. And so that's where you see kind of a really nice population balance, where at least visually the areas look somewhat equal. Now, equal has more to do with the density of the area than the physical size, but here it seems to balance both pretty well. Looking at 422, we see that District 4 covers the majority of the far most south, which is not super densely populated, but we see a nice split between 3 and 4 in kind of the southern mid section of town. And when I say southern and northern, I'm just talking about top, bottom. I'm not talking about like Woolley as a cutoff for south. I'm really talking more in general perspectives, because I know that some, depending on where you live in town, you may draw that line between different parts of town differently based on your experience living in town. So looking at one north and one south, here what I call these the quadrant maps. They feel like a 4 square, but not very square to me. So looking at 415, you see just some nicely divided, more kind of northeast, southwest, but you end up with some really interesting carve-outs. Like with 415, you see the eastern carve-out coming down into District 3, and depending on how you feel about the northern section of town being divided, that you may feel that's a good option. Whereas when you look at 2, the cut down is a little further to the east. I'm sorry, 402. The cut down on District 2 is a little further east versus kind of more city center, or closer to city center. Looking at 404, that's really one of those strong north areas where it kind of straight lines across the north and comes down about as far south as you can get it while maintaining the distinct community on the west side of town from the east side of town. And then looking at 416, you've got this really kind of interesting carve up with number 3. And what makes 416 legal is there are some houses in the tracks just up next to the freeway there, so they are actually connected. I know looking on these smaller maps you can't really see, but if somebody has a question about this particular map, after the presentation we can go to the online tool and really drill in and say how many people live there, what does it look like, and have that conversation. Now there were a series of maps that were put together with, my understanding was the expressed intent of putting as many council members in one area as possible. That is certainly an option when drawing maps, and so these maps share very close commonalities in the way 2 and 3 district areas were specifically drawn, although 419 is probably the most unique in the way that District Area 1 kind of cuts up to the north, as opposed to the other ones where it's more of a quadrant style design. So based on the plethora of opportunities presented in the 13 4-district maps, National Demographic is suggesting that if the community and council were to try to whittle this down, we would suggest starting by whittling down to maps 404, 417, and 422 for the reasons stated, but these are just suggestions and in no way binding. It's really just a spur of conversation. Somebody might say, hey, instead of 417, have you really looked at 419? I think that better represents what I was trying to accomplish when I drew that map, or when I look at that map, what's important to me. Looking at the 6-district maps, there are 20 legal maps, and once again, we have various splits between splitting 2 districts in the north, 1 district in the north, 2 in the south, 1 in the south, and so we end up with a lot of variations from kind of bifurcated areas to kind of pancaking, as we've discussed previously. And so when we look at 616 in the top left of the screen, we can see that this is kind of what I call a slider demographics, mainly because 2 and 4 look like little hamburgers sitting on top of a nice bun that layers up. And so we have a very compact community on the west in District 1, and you see that Districts 2, 4, and 5 cut into the kind of business district's central part of town. And so this might be an example of where you say you've got a united north, but you're really splitting some of the more dense economic areas. Looking at 618, this is what Dr. Johnson called the pancake, and that's where you basically stack the districts one on top of each other, so with the west kind of being off on its own. So you've got 6 being its own southern, very strong southern district, and 3 being a very strong northern district, and then layering based on population size, almost like a stack of pancakes for 2, 4, 5 in the middle. Looking at 621, once again, very strong northern-southern options here. And so the real split here is you see 3 kind of grabs the northern part of the economic downtown area, and 4 grabs kind of the mid-southern economic area. Looking at 629, once again, District Area 3, very strong northern, and you've got 2 and 4 splitting the economic area with a little cut-in on 1 and 5 on the southern end of the downtown area. And so real good a real distribution, good is really up to you, a real distribution of participation in the economic areas, or in the more densely economic areas. Another variation we've seen is really the desire, and I think this fed in very strongly with what we heard at the community forums and at the council meetings, was the desire to see the southern part of town split or have multiple representatives. And so that's the purpose of slide 14, is looking where there's 2 districts in the southern side of town. And so the extent is going to be is where's the vertical divide and how far can you get one or both areas to go. So when we look at 623, we see 4 covers of the west all the way to the east all the way to the south, and 5 comes up the western side of the south, but right into the middle of town. It doesn't continue around to the west. Looking at 626, similar, except that 5 goes all the way south and 4 is pushed up and east a little bit. Is there water? Okay. And looking at 628, we similarly have 4 going all the way down on the eastern side, covering the southernmost area of town, and 5 coming up the west side into the center of town, center south as well. And a similar map on 635, except that the southernmost portion of town is more evenly divided all the way down to the southernmost edge of the city. Looking at a united center, the idea was that there would be a representative that would be in the center of town, so in the economic zone, more strongly held by one council member necessarily than having several council members abutting the economic area. And so when you look at 624, you see Council District 4 would have the predominant economic zone, and you see 4 as well in 617 and 2 in 627. Now, one of the things I found interesting was the way 5 on 627 kind of went around the eastern side of town, and that really has a lot to do with the choices that were made in 2, 3, and 4, the way those areas were designed, and the density of the population that lives in there compared to the surrounding area that was left over for 5. So in my mind, when that was drawn, that was almost an afterthought that was kind of residual. Looking at the blended center, this is having the most number of council districts crossing into the economic zone, the center of town. And so when you see a very common theme in 612, District 6 is kind of in the heart, but you got cut-ins on 2 and 3 in the north and 5 in the south. 4 and 1 are kind of excluded. You got a nice little notch in with number 1 on 612. Looking at 613, you've got 6, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5 even comes up right through the center. So we did find a way to get all 6 council districts to touch the economic zone, or the heart of the business engine of town from a retail perspective. Looking at 622, we had to do some interesting cutouts. For example, with 1, we had to do a cut in to the economic area, and 6 really, no matter how we shaped it, just couldn't make it all the way up based on the factors with 4, 5, 1, 3, and 2. And then in 625, we see Area 6 really is kind of in the heart of town there. The economic zone. And 2 kind of cuts around, and 3 cuts in an interesting way, but it doesn't necessarily follow main streets, especially when you look at 3. So I think there could be conversation around the idea of the way those cutouts and the choices were made there, if somebody were interested in this type of map and liked other features of that particular map. And once again, one of the options always is to draw maps where you put as many of the council members together in 1 or 2 council districts, and that's what the stated purpose of these maps were. It's an option. These are legal maps, that's why they're being presented, but they didn't necessarily carry the same themes. For example, in 631, you see a little bit of that center economic interest, the way the cut-ins are being done right at that portion of town. well, then you see a real kind of one in the south on 631, 633, 634, and you're splitting the south in 632. So for the start of conversation, National Demographics is suggesting narrowing the maps and offering a suggestion of 621, 622, 624, and 635 to narrow down the number of 6 district focus maps. There were 5 legal maps with 8 districts. All of them meet, and all of these maps meet the legal requirements. Now with 8 districts, you know, it's really tough to split the north, split the south in the same ways you see with a 6 district map, just because of the size of each trustee area or council district area. And so when we look, for example, at 804, 805, 806, 807, 808, they all have singular southern areas. But most of them have fairly strong northern areas, so you see a fairly large, dense area 2, 3, 4 in 804, 805, and 806. And it's really just the way they're choosing to carve up the center of town, and that's because the center of town is very dense. And so when we look at 4, 5, and 6 in 804, and 5, 7, and 8 in 805, and in 807, really 5, 6 with an interesting cut up in area 7, but area 2 just peeks in just a little bit. And so what we tried to do was just provide you options that made sense. And so when we were looking at the 8 area maps, we really felt like the 804 and 808, just because they seem to follow geographically, as far as looking at it from the eye, following larger streets, so people living in each of these communities could more easily predict which area they might live in when they're looking at a map, versus some of the kind of really grainy cutouts that we see in some of the more detailed street level maps in 805, 806, and 807. And so for that reason, for the purposes of discussion, we're suggesting narrowing down the 8 district focus maps to 804 and 808. And so very quickly, we covered a lot of maps. And really the hope in doing this and having this workshop was not just to take National Demographics suggestions, but really to talk through and hear your questions, and I'm going to vigorously take notes about what's important to you about any of the maps you want to talk about. And I have the ability to, we're going to log on to the interactive web version, so I will pull up whatever map you're talking about. If we want to zoom in, zoom out around certain areas and talk about, you know, this cutout's important to me, or that's important to me, or this neighborhood, we can do that. And we have the neighborhood overlays on the maps as well. So really, I'm hoping that this presentation will spur conversation, so that way we can give really good information back to the council, and they can start working on narrowing this down with your input as they work toward choosing a final map, which may be one of these or may be a newly created version based on a lot of input. So we're not locked into these. These are just spurring the conversation about what's important to you. So we already covered these. Okay. So with that.
And while Mr. Stein's coming up, if anyone else wants to fill out student cards, we would welcome you.
First, I have a question to ask. Now, looking at the Ventura map, they have 7 districts, I believe. They weren't given a choice, apparently, to have 4, 6, or 8 districts, but decided to have 7 districts. So why is it that City Council can't have the next public meeting decision made if they're going to have 4, 6, or 8 districts? Why can't that decision be made quickly so that they can then focus, and the community can then focus on what they feel is the best 4, 6, 8 district map, instead of waiting until the very last public hearing for City Council to make a decision, well, we're going to have 4, 6, or 8 district maps. But I think that decision should be made quickly. In the next public hearing, I'd like to know why legally we can't do that, as one example, City of Ventura was able to go right off the bat with a 7 district map. Now I have some comments to make. Some of the maps I drew were drawn in consideration of the fact that we have some areas that have growth that not projected on this because these maps are based on the 2010 census. Most dramatic case is North Oxnard, where we have both wagon wheel going up, and there's been a great deal of development taking place at the collections in River Park. So when you have, in drawing these maps, they have to be within 10% of the smallest and largest within the same district size. But we have certain areas, such as South Oxnard, that are highly dense. If you leave some room for growth in North Oxnard, having a larger disparity with a lower population, that kind of factors in the fact that this area now, in reality, is actually growing a lot more. I project or suggest that at this point in time, North Oxnard might have 5,000 to 7,000 more people than represented on the census because it's grown so much. And you can't consider that in of itself a drawing map because we have to use the specific guideline of the 2010 census. So I'd like to consider, as you go through deliberations, consider the fact we have large growths that aren't currently represented in the census, but in planning on the 2020 election, reality is we're going to have 5,000 to 7,000 more people in that area than the maps currently suggest. We have an example of our densities is looking at the map between Channel Islands, between J Street and C Street, or C Street to J Street. We can see all the census blocks along Channel Islands. We have over 1,000 people living along that street, either side of it. That's the density we have to deal with. Whereas you go down the western Oxnard area, we have a lot of areas where are largely less dense because they're more spread out. So that's one of the considerations we have when we look at the area between West Oxnard and East Oxnard. And South Oxnard is particularly more dense. We have, again, no representation per se in South Oxnard, and by having 3 districts or 3 representatives as part of South Oxnard, perhaps that might feel that people of South Oxnard are more included in the city's activities, versus the way they're feeling right now, there's no representation in South Oxnard. Now,
Okay, Mr. Stein, your time's up on that. You get another chance to speak, and if you can go ahead and let someone else, but I will answer your question as well.
I was led to believe I was the only speaker, but that's okay. I'll yield the floor.
Okay. Your question is why hasn't the City Council made a decision yet regarding the number of districts? It is up to the City Council to make that determination. I can say in the staff report for the January 29th meeting, which I drafted today, we are making a recommendation the Council narrow down between 4, 6, or 8, but it is up to the Council to make that determination when they'll be deciding on the number of districts, the particular maps, as well as when elections would be held in each district. So.
Next speaker is Clay Downing.
So my name's Clay Downing, and I'm a resident of the River Park neighborhood. And so this is somewhat an observation of mine and what I support, but also I have a question on anecdotally or what's been observed about kind of the benefits to a downtown area. So specifically, it seems like having multiple districts sharing the downtown area would lead towards a more productive downtown. You've got more council members, theoretically, that can support that economic area. And so I wanted to know if there are some examples of where that has been successful, either kind of doing that split area in a downtown or kind of economic engine type of area versus other anecdotes where there's been a benefit on having maybe a compact district that just kind of owns that area.
Sure. The most obvious local city who has where all the council members share an interest in the economic engine of downtown would be Pasadena. All of the council members' zones touch Colorado Boulevard. And that was in one of the first presentations, actually the first 2 community engagement presentations, which are on the city's trustee area website, if you're interested in seeing those. It boils down to what kind of input community members want to have. So if your desire is to have shared interest in economic development, then certainly that's a way to encourage the council to go. On the flip side, if you want to have somebody who really is forced to hear your concerns on a specific topic in a specific area, then having less division around that particular item or part of town would be ideal for you as a community member. So it's really what part of that gray spectrum appeals to you most and that you would want the city council to lean toward. So certainly if you lean toward the division of the economic engine of town, then they need to hear that. If you lean toward really, no, I like to see one person that I can really just chase around until I know they've heard me and are representing me on that issue, then that's kind of the other way to go. Did that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you.
I do have a couple answers that might be
Okay.
helpful.
Okay.
So
Mr. Steins,
for Mr. Stein's questions, you got the first one. And so there was, the second question had to do with population balance when we're drawing areas. And so under the Federal Voter Rights Act, when the council adopts maps for this iteration, they have to use the census from 2010. And so what that very often means, and Oxnard is not unique in this, is that you may have one area, all the areas will have very close equal populations, total population, that's live human beings. But you may have wildly different voter populations in each council district. So you could have 8,000 registered voters in one area who actually vote, and in the next area you could have 1,000 people actually turn out to vote. And that's not uncommon at all. The other side of that particular coin is that the 2020 census will be done in 2020, and in 2021 the council will have to redraw their lines. And so certainly if it's important to you that as a community member, and you want it to be important to the council, that they draw or they adopt a map that accounts for some of the growth in town today in those maps and what that might look like, then you would expect to see a little more variance, a larger district, for example, in the northern portion of town, within the 10% threshold under the Federal Voter Rights Act. If you think, gosh, I'm engaged now, I'm definitely going to have to be engaged again because who knows will be sitting on the council after the 2021 census or 2020 census is published and the city goes through this process again, the maps can change fairly dramatically. It's typically minute changes along the edges of boundaries, but occasionally you see a pretty, a big dramatic swing in the way council districts are drawn. This is kind of a short-term problem. It's going to impact your next 2 elections, but important. So hopefully that got at that question. And then the idea of 3 districts in southern Oxnard, not possible per se with 4 council districts. Closer with 8, but 6 is really a push. So it just depends how small you want each council district area to be and where you want the dividing line to be for south. If you're truly looking at Woolley, you might get, if you bifurcate the south, you might get a tiny bit of the center part around Woolley with a 3rd district, but not very much. And we could look at some maps to demonstrate that if you'd like an example.
And the next speaker is John.
So I just have some questions about the headings here. On the plan summary statistics page, it says deviation.
Yes, sir.
What is that in reference to?
That would be in reference to the average median population. If you were, so for example, when you've got 4 districts, if you took the total population and divided it by 4, you would have the highest and lowest district. For example, when we look at number 402, the difference in population between the lowest and the highest district is 1.62% variance off the center, off the average
Okay,
population
so
size.
it's a variance from average then.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then the major LCVAP, what is that? The next column.
Latino citizen voting age
Oh, okay.
population.
All right. And then the next one is Latino citizen voting age, 65%
Percent plus.
What does that mean? Oh,
The number
that's
of districts in that map that have a
65
65
more than
plus.
65%.
Yes.
And then pairings, what is that in reference to?
That's if there are district council members in the same district when the map's drawn. So you could have 2 in District 2 or 3.
And then on the back on the demographics pages,
Yes, sir.
the deviations from ideal, that's just a comparison number in actual numbers. Like for instance, we have ideal here is 24,738. And the last page, map 808, just as a, oh, this one right here,
Oh, okay.
on the actual maps.
Okay.
So the deviation from ideal that's in actual numbers.
Correct. So 630, so
Right, and
for example,
percent-
number one,
and
695 would be
right.
2.18%
And
of
percent
24,000.
deviation, that's the percent in actual, in reference to actual numbers.
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right. And then the ACS, on further down on the page, ACS population estimate, are these projections based from the 2010 census?
No, actually, ACS is a different population from a different date, but the reason that one is used is it has to do with surname analysis. So the surname analysis is not from 2010; it's actually from we have information from 2016 and 2014. So that is tied back to the information that was tied to the 2014 surname analysis. And so where you get tricky on the surname analysis is you see lumping of groups that sometimes people are very unhappy with the lumping. So for example, especially around like the Filipino group, because the Filipino group could fall in the Latino Hispanic group or it could fall in the Asian group depending on their name or which family they married into.
And that's why the population numbers are different from the total population.
That's correct, but for drawing the actual boundaries, we have to use the 2010 census number of the 24,738 for a 4-district map. Or, I'm sorry, 8-district map.
8-district, yeah.
8-district map.
Okay, that should do it. Thank you.
Thank
Great
you.
questions, thank you. I like when we get technical.
Charles Kissner.
Hello. Well, first of all, I want to disclose that I work here in Oxnard. I live in Ventura, and so kind of seeing some of the things that have been going on for decision-making over in Ventura and how that's affecting the voters and everything with the districts over there. So a couple things I wanted you guys to consider. First of all, the Collection Esplanade Auto Center as a group in one zone is a real big economic engine, just like the downtown. So splitting those things, I think, where you've got 2 representatives and you've got the ability not only for having the discussion over what goes on in those areas versus having one person representing that, I think is a big to-do. I know in our downtown, one of the things that we were really looking at was that there were some of the proposals with the 7 members and the 7 districts, that 3 of those would be part of downtown. Well, that gives them a tremendous voting block and again, keeps the issues in that area. So they ended up deciding on having 2 people that would be there. And I think that the same thing for downtown, the same thing for, again, any of these economic zones. I think it'd be great to not have too much representation. Obviously, it depends on how many people we, in the end, have as city council members and so on. But bottom line is that I just don't want to see too much power, basically, directed towards those groups and leaving everybody else kind of out on the fringe. And then the other thing that I wanted to just say is that, I know looking at these maps, it looks like a lot of it is based on population, and I really think that getting into looking at the economic zones and maybe some of the other issues in those, so that you're looking at more than just the demographics that most people consider. I think this community has so many interesting agricultural areas that are very powerful, and they may not be in the city, but they're connected to neighborhoods and stuff like that. So there's an influence there. So just all these other little factors, I think we want to make sure that we're taking a good look at that and not just the numbers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Eileen.
My name is Ellie Tracy. I actually don't live in Oxnard now, but I lived there for many years in 2 different locations. One was in South Side and one was in Central. And certainly when I lived in South Oxnard, I felt that no one on the council even ever drove into my neighborhood. And so I like the maps that split the South Side long into 2 districts where they sort of go up and take other areas in. And then I lived in Central. And again, I learned that socioeconomics, to me, becomes far more important than cultural heritage. Because, there are a lot of wealthy Mexican descent or Spanish people in Oxnard, and there are a lot of poor, and the same with with other populations. So I really didn't like to see, culture to be included. I really prefer socioeconomics. Also, when I was downtown, there are quite a few apartment buildings. Well, those people don't vote. They don't even know what election district they're in, and they could care less. So, I really felt when I was in Central Oxnard that, again, it would be better to split it up so it went out more towards the suburban areas. And I wish I had a question for you, but, just figure it out, okay?
Well, your notes will certainly be shared with the entire council. And so everybody's bringing up and saying all their questions or suggestions, I'm documenting it all so we can put it in a summary.
Well, I just
and
want to
be
say one other
considered.
thing. The way the land use is set up in Oxnard, where most of the shops are in one area, and then if you live in Central or South, tough luck, there's nothing down there, especially if it's Southeast. So I would love to see, both times, I would love to see the zoning change so that there could be a little bit of commercial in each district, just for the convenience of the residents. So, that's it.
Great, thank you.
State card number 6, did you want to speak or did you just want your notes documented?
I want to see.
Okay.
How you doing? I'm Sel Medina. I'm a South Oxnard resident for about 16 years now. Resident of Oxnard for over like 30-some. I would like to mention that the 6th district is probably most appropriate, with 2 districts in South Oxnard. The reason for it is because of the expansion and the division. I think it's very important that we evenly distributed how the districts will work together. And I think by having 6 districts and having a mayor at large, that's a good number. Currently, if you just have 3 people to agree, you really control the whole situation. So it really defeats the purpose of just having 4 districts and having a mayor at large. So in order to expand that quick division of just 2 + 1 is 3, regardless of where you're at, you're still going to be outnumbered. So I think in order to have better representation, to go with 6 and to have the mayor at large. I also want to include it why the American Service for the Census to strongly consider the 5-year update of the projections as part of the inclusion of where the trends are in the 5-year mark from 2011 to 2016. That's very vital. I know that you're bound by the 2010 census, but we're only 2 years away into the 2020 census. So it's good to have a projection 5 years in, at least for the city council to consider. The other thing is to consider an overlay of the current neighborhoods that are over the districts. So hopefully there'll be 6 districts, and by reducing half of it and not splitting them in half, I think it's very important. You don't want to split already neighborhood councils that are together, and if I'm sure that some will, but also to consider that as a reduction of when these districts are done. But I think 6 will fit a model, and it would expand people's interests, not just concentrated on 3 people's interests for the greater good of the city. Thanks.
Mr. Medina, you had mentioned, it sounded like you were going to kind of dive in a little bit, or maybe you have thoughts on how the south end of town would be divided. You said 2, but did you have thoughts on how you would like to see it divided, or what you'd like the council to consider?
I really think, considering the how it's divided now, there's a couple ones that I saw that are kind of awkward division, but I think that a good division is to put it in an area where you have a balance of the demographics and an area where it could be done. I mean, typically between Channel Islands and Woolley could be one district, and from Channel Islands to Hueneme could be another district as well. I think you want to keep in mind that what the school districts are like as well in that area kind of splits with actually 3 school districts in South Oxnard. You have the Terra Vista, the Pleasant Valley. You also have Oxnard, and you have Hueneme. So you have three school districts to kind of deal with. So I think I want to look at the data a little bit more. It's the first time I've seen it. But I definitely think that having 2 in the South Oxnard will balance out having 2 in the north, and then the coastal area of Oxnard, which are very united in their area, and then having a downtown area really fits the model of everybody being equal. The center of Oxnard, the beaches, the new development in River Park, and the area about St. John's Hospital, and really finding a balance in the South Oxnard area. I've been on the Planning Commission for the City of Oxnard for 8 years, and been the sole South Oxnard resident for a long time during my tenure. So I know that there's a balance between that, and I think in the diagrams, I think there's a good balance that you guys are gonna develop. But I really think having a 6 is better than 4, and having a good balance that they don't pin each other against each other. That it's a really collaborative, and if it's this district, it'll be the Magnificent 7. We all kind of work together. You work with the mayor, you work with at least 2 or more of the majority in order to get things done, and I think that's what it should be. It's a good balance. I kind of liked a couple of them when a division was kind of a clear or horizontal.
Kind of like that?
Yeah, and I think it's very accurate when you kind of do the demographics, knowing where the mobile home park, which is more dense, and the new development that's planned, or the South Shore, if that ever gets done, and really considering the Esplanade with the development that's going to have, they're going to be different dynamics in that area, the wagon wheel, compared to the dynamics in River Park. So and combined with the people that live in Vineyard and the old Riveridge area, which is still very exclusive and a nice area. So you have to have a good balance up there that they feel that they're incorporated in the decisions. And again, just because you have somebody in your district doesn't mean you can't go to somebody else. I think it's important to have more rather than less, and I think that's the purpose, is to have a better representation, not just the same old 5 and 1, because that in itself is why we're here. So hopefully that can be considered.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, Burperl, Councilman, but I'm asking some questions on some comments that have been made and some clarifications from the staff. What I'm looking at right now, it looks like it's a neighborhood council overlay.
That's correct.
Okay, so if I were to ask for a specific map to see how the neighborhood councils would line up, I can do this?
Yes.
And you do that on the city's website?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, that answers that question. There was a question with respect to the population and economic drivers. These are set up based on population, not economic drivers, and that is because of the law?
So there are different ways you can balance the population with each different of the 4, 6, and 8 options. The way we drew maps, we definitely tried to give some options, and I think several of the community members who submitted maps gave options where you had multiple council members kind of dividing up the central part of town.
The wealthier, richer part of the city.
And then others where it was really just one person. So I think you have good choice, or I think the council has several approaches to discuss in what they have now, but certainly any one or 2 or 3 of the maps can serve as a model from which to draw another based on themes that we like or dislike in the others.
If we have areas that would be representative of agricultural entities, the agricultural entities for the most part are not within the city of Oxnard boundaries, is that a fair statement?
Yes, that's a fair statement.
Okay. The businesses that relate to them and supply them are in the city of Oxnard's boundaries. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
The definition of protected class, which initiates the Voters' Rights Act. What is the definition of a protected class? And what are those classes?
So for Oxnard,
Or
definitely.
for national and state level, not just Oxnard?
Sure. It would be the African American, Latino, and Asian populations are specifically written in the law.
So there's the only two protected classes?
Three. African American, Latino, and Asian populations.
Asian population, bigger parts. So other groups, Native Americans, Caucasians, they're not protected class, even if they are in a situation where they are a minority class?
Native Americans have been a protected class both inside and outside the Federal Voter Rights Act. And I was speaking specifically to the California Voter Rights Act
Okay.
In my previous response. What was the second part of your question?
So if we have a majority, I believe we've been presented that the majority of the city of Oxnard is a minority protected class.
Yes, sir.
And so the rest of the classes that now are minority, are all of those classes considered protected classes? One of them being Caucasian. This has been asked before. The answer is no, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
There's no way we could draw a map that would create a protected Caucasian class, nor could we draw a map that would have an overwhelmingly predominant Caucasian area.
Is there a way to
Go ahead.
is there a way to draw a protected class for the Latino community?
We have done that. So
We have done that.
in order to meet, when all the maps were drawn, when we said these met all of the guidelines of both the California and Federal Voter Rights Act, so all of the maps that we've presented here as legal maps meet those guidelines.
Are any of the maps in any of the districts in any of the 4, 6, or 8 not sufficient with a protected class for that district?
They're all compliant
They're all-
and legal.
okay.
Yes, sir.
I personally like the idea of having more council members, 6 or 8, and this is my opinion, and I have a question for your firm. If we go with 4, we're about 49,000 per representative, 6, about 32,000, and 8, about 24, and the city's growing. If we have to go through this whole rigmarole again to change this, it seems like this would be in a very few number of years when we could do this. We possibly could do this. Start the question over. Could we possibly do this anytime in the future if we wanted to change the numbers of districts again, or do we have to wait till the next census, the next adjustment of the lines?
Under the state law, you have the ability, if the council desired to do so, to increase the number of council members. So, for example, if the council selected 4 districts, later you could go to 6 or to 8 if that was a desire.
Does the opposite side work if they want to reduce districts?
We'd have to look at that. There could be some issues under either the Federal or California Voting Rights Act if the reduction in number of districts affected a protected class's ability to elect the council member of their choice. So that's a more danger-filled proposition to reduce the number of districts.
Okay. And the last question, thank you for letting me exceed my time. I appreciate that. Your firm submitted 2 maps.
Yes, sir.
422 and 808 that your firm did. Can you explain the rationale by showing those maps, why you did those maps? I'm not challenging them, but I'd just like to know, what did you see that generated your interest or your firm's interest or obligation working for the city of Oxnard to put those maps? And as I look at the back of the map, it's 422 and 808. Thank you.
Here it is, right here.
Right. No, I was just wanted to have both the presentation we discussed
Gotcha.
publicly as well as the details, so that way I could go back and forth.
Okay.
So, in looking at 422 first, part of what we were looking at was the concept of drawing a very strong northern district and a strong southern district. So when we look at so this is 422. And so the idea, perhaps if I'm going to take the overlay, the neighborhoods overlay off, just so you can see the colors a little better, and scroll out. That is not. Okay. So the idea in drawing 422 was that in the other strong, where we had a very strong northern area, was map 403. And so the idea was we wanted you to have more than one choice where you had a heavy northern area that really kind of, if you were kind of to take the population from the north, come all the way down and draw somewhat of a straight line, it would have a very compact group in the north, with the idea of dividing the south, because as we were listening to some of the conversation and just seeing the types of maps we were receiving, there was a lot of attention paid to the way the south was drawn up in the notes. So I gave you this map because it split the south. And so with 403, let me just toggle between them so you can see. With 403, the way the south was bifurcated was visually, it was basically splitting the south part of town in half. And so what we wanted to do was look at what if 3 was a little more compact and just brought up north just a little bit. And so when we switch back over to 422, we see that we scrunch 3 and push it up on the east side of town just a little bit. And then, of course, on the southern central part of town, we have to push over one street on Savior's Road. It doesn't come back over as we get up toward the mid part of town like it does in 403. So I'll stand up and just speak. So basically, in 403, it pushed back over in here, number 4 did, and this came down to make up the difference in population. And so really what we're trying to do is just provide, you had one that was evenly split, and so we were saying, okay, you still have the south bifurcated, but the way they're bifurcated, the way those particular communities are built, maybe there's a preference of one over the other. And of course, we offered that before we had a lot of, here's what I think about this map. And so what we were trying to do is provide options to spur conversation. And so really the first couple passes at the maps, is the idea is to hear, what do we like, what do we dislike? Because that really should start narrowing down the conversation on what you want to see happen in each part of town. How do you want to?
808. And then 808.
Okay, let me do 808. So when we looked at the eight district focus maps, really it boiled down to cleaner lines, mainly because the areas were so small. It's often when we find you have small district areas, the community needs more predominant streets to say, yeah, that's where my trustee area cuts, or my district area, council district cuts off. And so when we looked at, for example, 805, 806, some of the line choices we felt could be a little harder for community members to keep in mind. And we see that even with some of when we try to put all the council members into the center part of town, you end up with some pretty interesting lines along smaller streets. That does make it a little more difficult for people to know where they live. And fortunately, the city will have a tool where you can punch in your address and it tells you which council district you're in. So there is an easy way to get it. But graphically, when you look at these maps, it can be a little tough. And for those who are not computer savvy, you certainly don't want to make it any more difficult than necessary. So when we were looking at the difference between the recommended 804 and 808, it had to do with the way the boundary areas cut into each other. So for example, looking at 7 in the south, going up to Bard Road with a minor cut up, and then it's cut into, you see the way 6 cuts in right there on the top of 7. Well, 6 could have cut in further north up into 2. A choice was made there in the way those lines were drawn. And so when you look at the way 6, 7, and 8 come together on the south side of town compared to 804, it was minor choices on the south end. So For example, on 804, on the western side, you see that now the southernmost district, being 8, comes up a little further north past Bard, where 808 ends at Bard on the west side of the south. Similarly, when we look at the northernmost district on 804, it doesn't come down in, you see where the pink kind of comes down to the yellow where Area 3 is, and it really stops there around the 1 and the 232. When we look at 808, we see now Council District 4, which was where 2 was before. It doesn't go as far west, but it comes further south into that area just south of the 101, which is a very dense area. And so it's just how you choose to make those balances between east, west, and if you cut off one side, you've got to add to the other. And so here we're cutting off on the west and adding to the south, trying to provide that balance to further that conversation. Yes, sir.
No, it's okay.
I just have a quick question regarding your discussion of 422 and 403 in the 4 districts. I don't know if you're aware, but in 422, it really gerrymines the Colonia neighborhood into the South neighborhood as representative in the South. And I think it could be looked at deliberately. And then in the map,
Could you say that again, please?
in map 422,
Okay.
the Colonia neighborhood is gerrymandered into the 3rd district of the South district. So it cuts out from its northern area. So I think it almost looks very deliberate. And in 403, it cuts it in half in the district of District 3 and in District 2. So instead of combining it, what you did is you kind of cut it in half between 2 and 3, which is also, that cuts one of the original neighborhoods in half without really having a solidified representation. So again, these are the kinds of things that happen, and I think it's important to have the community involvement, so those errors, when someone's trying to look at it online, you could have some cultural background on that.
Absolutely, and I want to be clear. Certainly, if you don't like the NDC maps, by all means, blame NDC, blame me. But people worked very hard to provide different options for different reasons. Best I can tell, the 403 and 422 maps really were attempting to create a strong northern section and 2 southern sections. And unfortunately, when you fill in around 1 or 2 things that you think are important, the way the kind of middle of the map gets divided up is less respectful to the things that people who care about the middle might consider them to be. I just don't want us to in any way besmirch somebody spending a lot of hours and energy building a map for the benefit of discussion. All input is valuable here.
Karen, are there any more speakers?
There are not.
Okay. Okay, very good. Thank you.
I'd like to make some commentary, if I may.
Sure.
The previous speaker talked about splitting up Colonia, and I noticed that Camino del Sol is one of the streets I use as a line of demarcation. There's also an economic line of demarcation because south of Camino del Sol is an older community, and north of Camino del Sol is a newer community with a different demographic economically. Now, we're trying to focus on an economic zone. You think of downtown Oxnard being an economic zone, that's a fallacy. 40 years ago, downtown Oxnard was a very vibrant economic zone, but the focus lately has been along the 101 freeway. The economic sales tax is a lot stronger along there. Now, the previous speaker spoke about the desire of having community centers within Oxnard, and economic shopping centers do exist throughout Oxnard. For example, at the south end of Rose, there's a shopping center. It's not very well used. Again, for whatever reason, people are not shopping there, but there are pockets of shopping centers throughout Oxnard. So when a speaker speaks that she'd like to see more pockets of economic development, those pockets are there, but merchants, businessmen, have to have an incentive to want to build a business there because it makes no sense to have a business if there's no foot traffic. So considering the amount of foot traffic we have along the 101 freeway, people are more drawn to have a business where there's going to be more traffic. Likewise, you go to the same area, you see there are pockets of development in North Oxnard. They're just empty buildings. Ashley's Furniture, for example, is one part of a shopping center. It's only a building, but there are 8 buildings outside of Ashley's shopping center that are completely vacant. So we have a great deal of vacant office space and retail space throughout Oxnard. So when we look at economic drivers, what drives a businessman to want a business in a particular location is foot traffic. And there's not enough economic foot traffic for a business to survive, that business will fail, which is why we have a certain amount of blighted areas. In drawing my gerrymandered maps, one of the points I was trying to make with the maps was the fact we have 1/6 of the population with all elected representatives in there. And that's just show a focus point of where reality of life is. They did not go there and become elected, but they happen to be elected and living there. So that's just one of the things I drew these maps to show the attention to the fact that this is the reality of life. We have 6 council members living in an area that can be defined as 1/6 of the population, and that's reality. But we have areas that are West Oxnard that are wider than, say, South Oxnard, but that's because of the economic vitality. We have homes along the beach that go for 7 figures. We got homes in South Oxnard that go for a quarter of that. Again, that's an economic reality. And with money, you have the ability to have as much space or little space as you want, as compact you have. We have areas down by the beach that's very highly packed, the colony, a high-rise section of people who live in condos by the beach.
Just because you hit on an area that does affect how I would attempt to draw or make suggestions to the council. You talked about some of the drivers of the economic engine and the way they're spaced around town. Would that cause you to provide any additional advice, or would you look at one of the maps and say, this more closely kind of aligns with what I'm talking about regarding the kind of economic drivers? So we can make sure that we kind of attach those notes to one or two of those.
I think the economic drivers, while you'd like to talk about it, it's irrelevant. In the fact that we have pockets throughout Oxnard that we have shopping centers. They're just not being used.
Right.
They're vacant, they're blighted, there's some business in there, but they're blighted because...
Would that information cause you to weigh in differently or on any of the other maps so that the council can consider?
I think the focus should be taken away of downtown Oxnard, having 5 representatives from downtown Oxnard, because we have 5 council members who've ignored downtown Oxnard for 20 years. One of the complaints of the downtowners is the fact that they can't get city council members to participate with economic drivers in downtown Oxnard. So focusing on the fact that we have 4 council members of 4 districts, 6 districts, all focusing downtown Oxnard, doesn't take away from the point that they ignored it already. The point that's being made that we have strong economic drivers along North Oxnard, and the fact that it's great to have 2 representatives North Oxnard, still takes away from the fact that, reality is the fact that business will succeed if there's foot traffic. And the drawings of these district maps, the purpose of elections, has no bearing, in my opinion, on economic drivers.
That was what I was looking for exactly. That was the note. You were getting toward it, and I just wanted to kind of make sure that it was heard in a very concise way. So I did write down that basically you would like to see, or you'd like the council to remove some of the focus from the downtown as an economic driver, so not focus so much on that area is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, it's because city council members, for the most part, have ignored it in the past.
I understand. What I can't do is relive the past, but I can certainly make sure the notes for what the future of the city will look like are heard and concise and listed in a way that makes sense to everybody.
Okay, Mr. Stein, if we can see if anyone else would like to speak, then you get another turn.
you very much for letting us speak. My name is Ronald Orejo, and I'm in favor of more than 4 districts, particularly for a number of reasons. For a larger membership, being someone who used to work on city staff, the various committees that the council members have to go take a lot of their time and not seen by the public. I think that there'd be less stretch with their time and energy if there are more council members to go around for all the committees that they have to go to, all the special committees that happen, and all the special events that happen throughout the city. More council members would be closer to the average number of constituents of similar-sized cities in California. As one of the council members said in the previous public session, that even with 8 council members, we would have more people in a city in each district than similar-sized cities just right in our county. More members would have a greater diversity of ideas. And I know there was a comment from the mayor that that discussions happen to end long, but that's the role of a mayor in regards to setting the agenda. You can always put time limits, and that's what's happened in another city that I used to be involved in that had 11 council members. One particular map in regards to 8 districts that I like is 806/807. They're very similar just for a few precincts. You can divide 806, 807 into 4 major districts of 2 council members each. You can call the first and second the Western District, which consists of the beach area and Oxnard Airport. The third and fourth district being the 101 corridor of the Northern Oxnard Collection District of the third and St. John area in the fourth. In the 5th district, you have northern 5 Points and 6 southern 5 Points, which could be considered the downtown area. And in the southern district, the Oxnard College area in the 7th, and the southern district just specifically in the 8th. In particular, of course, I would say I know all of Oxnard, but of course I don't. I used to live near the Oxnard College area, and I now currently live in the 4th district of St. John's. And so, in particular, a lot of these maps didn't keep the area along Oxnard College. They didn't keep them together. It was split into a couple other districts, and so that's a little bit of my bias in that area. And in regards to the 4th with St. John's, in that I think that's one area that should be combined or kept together. If we happen to just go into 6 districts, I'd recommend 617 for the same reasons that I stated, of Oxnard College staying together and St. John's Hospital area being one, although I would have a couple of recommendations in regards to the actual shape of the districts, which I can do at a later time. Also, I know we haven't talked about the sequencing of district election. Oh, crap. I'll do it on my next round. Thank you. I'll make this 1 minute. I would recommend that we go into something that the Illinois Senate has done. Right now, my recommendation is that in 2018, everyone does 4 years, but in 2022, 1/3 of the council districts would be a 4-2-4 schedule, the second would be a 4-2-2, and the third would be a 2-4-4, allowing people to vote for their council members some part of the city every 2 years. But at the end of the census period, there isn't a bias for council members to vote for districts that definitely keep them away from another council members, which I have seen in previous cities. It may not be blatant, but it could be there. And that's why I think the Illinois Senate sequencing of elections would be great after 2022, but making it 4 years right now from 2018 to 2022. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry. I did want to just point out, you mentioned that you wanted to kind of give some feedback on actually like where the lines are. At some point in the future, I would just implore you not to wait too long. We want to make sure that the council has heard everything possible before they start whittling down on 4/8/6 before they've heard your input.
Yeah.
So if there are specific things you'd like to say, or if you want to go home and email us, the link is on the webpage. Certainly we can make sure that we produce something or help you produce something that takes into account
Okay.
where you are on that.
Well, then I'll just take a couple of minutes. If you happen to go
Sure.
into 6 districts, I recommend 617 for various reasons, except that I would move the 4th district that contains, that with this, that's surrounded by North Rose, Camino del Sol, and 34, and move that into the 3rd district, and move the 3rd district that's west of the 1 into the 4th district, and you probably have to do some maneuvering in regards with the 2nd district to get the populations to be correct, because I think the 4th district is a little bit weird how it's so long and going all the way east, and the 3rd district going west of the 1. But other than that, I think that would be great for the neighborhoods in keeping, there's 2 in the Southern District, Oxnard College area is there, the Beach District and Oxnard Airport, Collection in Northern, and you have the downtown in the 4th.
Okay.
But I personally like 806 or 807 for the other reasons I stated also. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else want to speak before Mr. Stein comes back for another round?
I'm interested in, when you asked about Mr. Stein's comments with respect to economics and stuff, this is based on, how are you, as a council member? They didn't pitch it to us that this was going to be based on economics. If we base it on economics, I'll give you my 2 bits, okay?
Yes, sir.
What if we change the zoning in the city of Oxnard? What if we gave the incentives to developers that we've given incentives to developers that have done the north end of town to the same incentives to the south end of town? That would be economic drivers for the south end of town. I don't know if
Absolutely.
you want to put that in there. I mean, do you want that information now? Or?
Well, we made certain assumptions that downtown was part of the, major economic engine, and it's clear that you're probably, well, it seems rational to me, you're probably generating more sales tax revenue closer to the freeway. And we didn't get that information necessarily in advance. It's certainly a relevant part of the conversation, and we attempted to draw more towards city center than toward the freeway. But if we received instructions, hey, we'd really like, if consider the freeway area the economic driver and draw, where the majority of districts touch that, you're going to get a very, very different looking map under those criteria. So certainly any criteria the council or community would like considered, to the extent that we can get there within the law, we will attempt to help facilitate that.
Because I may have made a misunderstanding. I thought we were to deal with the situation is at hand, not what the situation could be in the future.
Well, you have to use the 2010 census population for the purposes of balancing. And so where you've seen major growth since then, it's not truly going to be balanced today. But so you could have, particularly like in the north, a lot more registered voters in an area that has, using the old population today than you did 10 years ago.
Okay.
But that, unfortunately, is not a consideration under the California Voter Rights Act. We have to use the 2010 census population.
Because, and the only reason I bring up the zoning, if there were some changes in the council's decision and they wanted to, if something was brought forward and they wanted to change zoning, or they took it upon themselves to change zoning, there could be a tremendous difference in the way the city of Oxnard looks. And it would be a driver if there were incentives given that have been given in the past for, say, River Park or redevelopment agencies for other ends of Oxnard, starting from the south going all the way up to the north. There's an economic driver on the east part of Oxnard in the 3rd Street corridor, and the name escapes me right now, but it's some sort of a tax-free or foreign trade-free zone. If that ever gets off the ground and they get some traction, it could make a big difference on where the economic interests are in the city of Oxnard. I think it's going to take a long time at the present time to rival what's going on with the collection, but I think that was a decision made by elected officials and developers and people that wanted to invest money, and investing money is the opportunity of an individual, but there should be no risk, there should be no guarantee of invested money returning a profit. If you want to invest money, there should be a risk, and it should be assumed by the investor, not the residents in the city of Oxnard, which in my opinion has happened in the past. So if there were some tweaking of certain set rules in the city of Oxnard, zoning being a big one, the city could look totally different in a very short period of time, in my humble opinion. So thank you.
Yes, sir. And just for the audience's edification, one of the few positives of the California Voter Rights Act is that you do have to go through this process after every census. And as cities evolve over time, repeating the process does allow for minor or even major changes in the way areas are drawn to account for if those are the predominant considerations, then we want to make that gives the council the opportunity to consider or change the way they're looking at those considerations every iteration. So, yes, sir.
Okay, anyone, before Mr. Stein, anyone else wish to speak? Or? Mr. Stein, you're up.
One of the concerns I have is the results of the November election. If you have a district where we have 2 council members elected because of the current incumbency and the results of the recall, and then we have the November election and we have 2 council members still in the same district, we could possibly have an unrepresentative district. Or in some case, we might have a district with 2 council members in it, again leaving unrepresentative districts. How is that going to be addressed under the California Voters' Rights Act if we have no representatives for a district because of the number of council members we can have and the number of districts we're elected to? There's a potential of having ghost districts.
Yeah, I'll jump on that.
This is actually a sequencing question, so the city's attorney will explain.
Under the California Voting Rights Act, none of the terms of council members are shortened. So basically, we have 2 council members whose term ends in 2018 and 2 council members whose term ends in 2020. So regardless of whether or not we go to districting, the council members whose term goes to 2020 will remain at-large council members until 2020. So there's so many different scenarios we could go through about when elections would occur in which place, but it will depend on several things. First, it'll be the number of districts that the council chooses, be it 4, 6, or 8, and then it will determine where the council members live. As Robert spoke about before, one of the factors under the Voting Rights Act is to follow the will of the people. So we'd look to kind of match up the election dates based on in which district the council members live. So those are one of the factors, but it's premature to go through the scenario about when elections will be held in each district until the council makes a determination on the number of districts that will be drawn and then where those district lines are actually drawn. Yes.
Well, the actual issue of a ghost district has not been addressed because we could potentially have 2 or 3 districts, or at least a district with no elected representative in that district as a result of the current incumbency at large versus transferring over to an at-large district.
Well, I'll start and let Robert go there. As I mentioned, there may not be a council member elected from a district where we have if assuming the council goes to districts and we have 2 council members who are elected whose term goes until 2020, there will not, so let's say we have 4 districts now and we go to 6 districts. For 2 of those seats, the council members, there will not be a council member elected from those districts because you're going to have 2 at-large council members. So, but it's, once again, until we pick the number of districts, we can't determine if there'll be so-called ghost districts, but the transition period is always complicated.
It is, and that is actually part of the conversation. So as we narrow down, it's not just about where the lines are drawn, it's about what is the sequencing. And so depending, once we get down to a certain number of maps, say less than 6, then we would start including what the sequencing for each map would look like. So you would see, oh, this one is vacant, this trustee area is vacant, so it might have an election on 18, it might have one on 20, or it might stay at large because you've got 2 council members in an area, one whose period ends on 18 and one who goes through 20. Well, the 18 would be up for re-election, the 20 would be at large until 20, and then they couldn't run in their district unless they moved. So it creates all kinds of moving parts where somebody could run, somebody may not legally be allowed to run again, depending on which choices are made.
So the decision will be made end of February, I believe. Pick the date. At that point in time, we'll know what districts we're going to have. We know what council members we're going to have. So when we have the election in November, at that point in time, we'll know that we have representatives for all districts running at one point or the other, because if you have ghost districts, then we could have representatives running in that election, and whether it's going to be for 2 years or 4 years, that's up to the decisions taking place in the future at the time decisions are being made. So it's quite possible that in November, there will be representatives running for each district, and it won't be a ghost district.
That's actually not the case necessarily, Mr. Stein. As I mentioned, 2 of our council members' terms does not end until 2020. So there will be at least 2 districts within the city that will be at large until their terms expire.
But they might be in separate districts at the time the maps are drawn.
Well, these are all hypotheticals
That's right.
until we actually put pen to paper and make a decision, the council makes a decision on the district boundaries, we can't make those determinations.
So theoretically, let's say when a gerrymandered district is selected.
Okay.
If all 5 council members in that one district,
All 4 council members, you mean?
all 4 council members
Okay.
in one district.
Right.
But we say we have 6 districts now. We go from,
Okay.
So we then have 1 council member for that district, but we actually have 2 council members, presumably, that stay in there. Or all 4, because recall could still end up there, again, that's, down the line, but we'd still have n number of districts that have no representations, and they presumably would be elected in November.
3 would be a snap election. Yeah, so 3 of them would be a snap election in that case.
All right.
So 3 would be up for election, including the 2 incumbents that were in one trustee area up for election at that time.
Unless we expand out the number of council members.
It just depends how the lines are drawn and how people are grouped.
Okay.
Definitely.
I think I alluded to the fact that we do have streets like C Street and J Street had geographical boundaries. We also have geographical boundaries based upon railway lines and along other demarcations such as physical attributes. I'm concerned that some of the areas, particularly around the area along Woolley, we have industrial parks, and we have populations in there of 1 or 2 people that may have not been included, or that were included in the census map, but because they actually didn't have residential housing there, they were part of the map. Now, this is a minor aberration because it doesn't affect the 25,000 people in there, unless I suddenly go through my 2020 census and report I got 25,000 people living in my house. But be that as it may, we have some minor errors in the mapping because people are reported to be living there when probably they actually aren't, because they're not supposed to be living in an industrial park.
Okay, Mr. Stein, we're going to go ahead and see if anyone else wishes to speak.
Homeless people are included in the census.
Make one clarification.
Of course.
When I said I favor dividing by socioeconomics, I really meant, I don't want to see all the wealthy people living here and all the poor people living in the ghetto. I mean like equal socioeconomic divisions.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Okay, anyone else wish to speak at this point in time?
Just a question. Mr. Stein has asked a lot of good questions, but do you guys, your company, have you had any experience with any cities that have come up with a scenario so that if anybody is interested, they could Google that city and see how they handled it?
Yes,
Maybe some cities' names or something?
those were actually, we gave probably the best cross-section in California you're going to see in those 5 maps we showed on the initial 2 engagement presentations before any maps were drawn. We provided both cities and school districts, which the rules are very, very, very similar on how you can draw lines and how you might see kind of more of a vertical or horizontal, or the way areas can be divided up. And so we share those for exactly that reason. Yes. So it's
Yes, and just for the public or people watching at home, you can go to oxnard.org/districts. We also have all the PowerPoints that have been presented are available online, so you can, Robert, if you want to scroll down, the PowerPoints are going to be near the bottom, I believe.
there we go.
So we can click on those.
Yes, sir. And so this is the first presentation where we talked about the idea of what it means to go from at-large to district areas and the laws and rules. And when we get right back, it's on the second one. November 22nd. talked about protected classes, and then we talked about some sample maps. So, for example, when we look at the Glendale Unified, when you look kind of in there's a diagonal where you see the convergence of areas A, B, and C coming together. That's actually a mountain range. So that would be the example of geography or topography posing as a natural demarcation line. The Pasadena, where you see all 7 districts coming together, that's Colorado Boulevard. And then where you see Central Unified, when you look at the top right of that particular map, that would be considered an economic zone. So you've got all the areas reaching into the economic zone. When you look at Compton, the economic zone is actually about 1/3 of the way down. You see the horizontal line, but you see some interesting cutouts and cut-ins that are a little abnormal, and those are specifically to ensure kind of a division. So no one of the members had so much of the economic engine, for example, that would be impossible to unseat in an election because they had theoretically the financial resources of the existing power structure. And then in South Pasadena, it was very much about communities of interest and far less about, there's a lot of conversation about where the parks were, what types of trees were on different blocks, because each block has its own type of tree and it's an arbor city. And so the conversation was very, very different about different types of things, and that would be, South Pasadena would be an example like that. Yes, sir.
Anyone else?
Okay, Mr. Stein, I think you're up.
No?
Okay.
Thank you all for coming out tonight and giving up your time. This is a really important issue, and the council definitely needs to hear your input. Everything that was said tonight has been written down and will be shared in written form. And hopefully soon it'll allow the council to start whittling down and making choices that represent you.
Great. Thank you so much for being here this evening.